Right. Welcome everybody to the latest in the series of talks organised by the School of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at Anglia Ruskin University. I'm Rowan McWilliam and I'm Head of History here at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. And I have one formal thing I have to tell you, which is that this talk is being recorded. And by joining, you are giving your consent to being a part of the recording. We're very much looking forward to the talk. And I would also encourage you, as I'm sure you have lots of questions, to put questions in the chat function, which I hope you can all find. Great, I'm delighted to be able to welcome Professor, who is a Professor of British History at the University of East Anglia. She is also the new president of the Royal Historical Society, which I'm particularly delighted about because history, as some of you may know, is being challenged by, shall we say, people who should know better the way that we write history. And I'm delighted to have such a strong defender of what we do as historians in Professor Griffin. She is a distinguished historian, particularly of the 19th century. She's also a broadcaster and the co-editor of the Historical Journal. And speaking for myself as a Victorianist, I'm delighted to say that she is a leading historian of 19th century Britain, with major studies of popular pastimes, hunting, of the Industrial Revolution, and above all, of everyday experience. Her book, Liberty's Dawn, has become, I think, one of the most important contributions to the history of the Industrial Revolution. She's also written one of the best short accounts of the Industrial Revolution, and I'm delighted to say she's also now working on a global history of the Industrial Revolution. But I suspect her this evening is going to concern her most recent book, which came out just last year, which is titled Breadwinner, An Intimate History of the Victorian Economy. Professor Emma Griffin.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Rowan, for that introduction. Now I'm going to try and share my screen. I've got a new broadband provider and it's been a little bit flaky. So if there's a problem, you might see me walking around the house to try and get a better signal, but let's hope it's going to stand up. So I am indeed going to talk tonight about my most recent work, which is about, it's entitled Breadwinner, An Intimate History of the Victorian Economy. So to give just a little bit of background, it follows on, as Rowan mentioned, I wrote a book about living standards and everyday life during the Industrial Revolution. And that book looked at working class autobiography. This is an example of the kind of autobiographer I was working with, William Lovett. He becomes a significant figure in the Chartist movement. And I think that really encapsulates a lot of the autobiography that exists for the pre-1850 period. Autobiographies were almost always written by men. And very often, despite humble beginnings, they tended to be written by men who had gone on and done something in their life, just as William Lovett, we see here, obviously went on and did something with his life. And that's why we have his autobiography rather than anybody else's. While working on this project, I loved working with the autobiographies, and I decided for my next project I would carry on working with them, but look at the full 19th century and carry right on down to the eve of the First World War. And as I started to do this project, it became very clear that different sorts of autobiographies, different sorts of sources exist. So here's just a few examples of the kinds of people who are writing autobiographies. So whereas Lovett is this well-dressed man in his suit, we've got now autobiographies, many written by women, which I think is a lovely, certainly starts to change the story very much indeed. We've got Edith Pratt here, for example. She's a domestic servant. She's obviously taking her wages and her Saturday afternoon off to go to a local, in Cambridge actually. She's working in Cambridge as a servant, and here she is, she's spending her wages getting a photograph taken of her. Herself. And what's really interesting about somebody like Elizabeth Pratt is that she doesn't do anything with her life according to the kind of the traditional narratives of mobility and achievement. She gets married and she raises a family, and that's her story. That's all there is to her story. So it's a very different kind of autobiography, where somebody starts working class and they really stay working class all through their life. The other side of the screen, we've got sitting down there in the middle, we see Maggie Newbury, again, a classic late 19th century working class family. Here she is, she's with all her brothers and sisters. They're a moderately respectable family, but nothing more than that. And again, she doesn't go on and do anything much more than get married. And that's the story of her life. It's about being a kind of a working class housewife. We also have autobiographies written by people from really humble circumstances. So Arthur Harding here on the left, his parents are both alcoholics. He ends up in an institution. He's engaged in petty criminality as a child. And we've got another autobiographer, Edith Huey, on the other side of your screen. Again, she ends up in an institution, a much more functioning family, but her father dies and her mother takes the opportunity to put her into a child's home in Devon. So we get a whole range of different kinds of people writing autobiographies.
Yes, no, thank you.
Different kind of people writing their autobiographies, and this is an example of the kind of sources that I'm dealing with. So those are the records. I'm looking at Victorian Britain, and there are already arguments around about life in Victorian Britain. And the really dominant story is that Victorian Britain was a time of prosperity, of rising real wages, a period where, after the period of the Industrial Revolution, where living standards were actually quite static and many people didn't gain from industrialisation, after about 1850, historians are much more positive, much more enthusiastic about the fact that economic growth is starting to filter through to everybody in society now. And this is an example of a demonstration of real wages, quite steady, as you can see, down to 1820, nothing much happening between 1820 and 1840, and then really sustained rise down to the end of the century, so that they're doubling quite comfortably over that period. And most historians don't really dispute that analysis at all. The problem when I started reading the working class autobiographies is that they didn't really support this idea of comfort and prosperity that's been depicted for us by economic historians. I'll give you some examples of the kinds of material that I was encountering in the autobiographies. Well, first of all, there's the story of Elizabeth Twist. So she's born in Preston in 1892. She's born into a really respectable working class family. It's a really small family, just one mum and a dad. A brother comes along about 6 years later, but it's a small family. And her father is a school teacher in an elementary school. This is work, by any measure, this is working class respectability. This is what she says about her diet. She says she recognises that she's got a comfortable life. The pattern of my childhood was a comfortable one compared with other babies in the neighbourhood. She also goes on, I used to observe my mother beat up an egg in a glass of milk and watch enviously as my father drank it. Nobody else was so indulged. Consequently, from my earliest years, I too got the impression there was something very special about my father. And there's a lot going on here that's worth unpacking, but for the moment, I just want to draw attention to the fact that she's talking about an egg. And an egg, even in this respectable, functioning, very kind of satisfactory working class household, but at the top of the kind of the working class pyramid, an egg is a luxury that Elizabeth Twist hardly ever gets to eat. And eggs aren't terribly expensive. We're only talking pennies here. And yet, even in this household, they're out of her range, really. And this is a respectable working class family, as we've already seen from the autobiographies that I presented to you. There are writers coming from much more humble backgrounds than Elizabeth's. I'll give you the example of Thomas Luby. He's born in Hume, which is near Manchester. It's only about 20 miles apart, away from Elizabeth Twist, born around the same time, 1883. His life could not have been more different. His parents are separated. He described a household, single mother household, much more fragile. And of course, there's no eggs in Thomas Luby's. In fact, there's not very much food at all. Let's see what he says. Food, he says, was scarce. In the morning, given a round of bread by his mother, but if he returned later in the day, rather than getting fed, he simply, quote, got into trouble. No food, of course. So this is a diet of bread, basically, which is very similar to the diet that people were living in pre-industrial Britain. Effectively, were living on bread, on diets of largely bread. as he says. So at one point, yes, I'll just explain. One point, he is a really a dysfunctional household that he's living in. Basically, his mother is unable to care for the children properly for reasons that aren't fully explained. It's quite interesting. He provides his story as part of a television interview with LTN. So you can imagine this news reporter in the 1960s thinking he's going to get some lovely stories about what life was like back in the olden days. And it's really a hideous story of neglect and deprivation that he gets. And the interviewer clearly wasn't expecting this kind of story to come out. So Thomas explains at one point that the kind of household breaks down. And as a child, he started to work for a sweet seller, and he ends up living with this sweet seller. So he's describing all of this to this hapless interviewer, who obviously was not expecting this kind of story. And he says, the interviewer says, "Did your mother not notice you're not living at home anymore?" And Thomas replies, "Oh, no, not my mother. She'd got 4 of us. 4 she couldn't keep, so I had to keep my way the best I could." And again, the interviewer's trying to get a bit more information about why a child of 10 is living on the streets and is not being cared for properly. And he says to him, "Why did you put up with this?" And he just returns to the interview and says, "Well, I hadn't been used to much all my life, much like a dog or any animal." So you can see this really doesn't, it jars with the story of prosperity and comfort and rising living standards. So a lot of what I was doing in the book was really trying to unpack these kinds of stories, because you can't just take 2 autobiographies and say, well, look, here's an example. But I had a collection of some 600 autobiographies. It's possible to go through 600 quite systematically and try and make sense of what's going on and why there's such a gulf between what I'm reading in these stories and what economic historians are telling us about living standards. So the background to all of this is making sense of the fact that households are divided between husbands and fathers, and it's the father's role to go out and earn the money. And that's why we measure, for example, real male wages, why we're measuring male wages, because men do most of the wage earning in this period. And what's supposed to happen in the working class family is the father goes to work, brings the money home, gives it to mother, and mother spends it on the family. So Billy Cotton, born in London 1899, describes the process. His father was dead straight about money. He remembered his father coming home, taking his leather purse on a Saturday, lifting up the flap, putting the money down on the table. "Here you are, Suki," he used to say, and his mother would take it and reach up high on the mantelpiece and put it there. So that's what's supposed to happen in the working class family. The money is supposed to be given to the mother, and then she goes about doing all the house keeping and the paying the rent and buying the food and cooking food and all the rest of it. Well, what I did with my autobiographies is just put them all through into an Excel spreadsheet and just simply pose the question, well, how are men providing for their families? How many fathers are there like Billy Cotton? And it came up with something in excess of about 200. So a significant chunk of fathers are doing what they're supposed to do, going to work and sharing their money, but clearly that's only part of the story. That's using the wrong thing. There's an awful lot of other autobiographers where, for some reason or another, this isn't happening. And I kind of went through systematically and tried to unpack what was going on in all of these other families. So what did I find? Okay, so about 200. It's the biggest, largest segment are moderately good providers, but there's an awful lot of other things going on. Well, the first thing to draw attention to, obviously, is an era of high mortality. Many families lose their male breadwinner through death. Now, this doesn't mean that somebody has no father at any point through their childhood. This is just a childhood that is disrupted by mortality. It may have happened late in life, late in childhood, it may have happened at the beginning. And mothers can and do remarry. So sometimes families can be patched together by this way. It's just a way of visualising the fact that families can be vulnerable to all sorts of exterior events, and mortality is one of them, and quite a significant one at that. But again, that's only a very small way to explaining what's going on in all of these families. We've only got to half of the autobiographies as yet. What else is going on? Well, there was a smallish number who described their fathers as being ill. This is completely beyond their own control. I was also quite surprised that it's not actually that many. What we find are fathers who are not unemployed as such, but who choose to work irregularly, and particularly when high wages are available in some high wage areas. Men can find that they can earn, an agricultural labourer might earn 10 shillings a week. At the docks, you can earn 5 shillings a day. So some of the men are choosing to work for 2 days a week or 3 days of a week, and then take some of the time off in leisure. And you see this as well in places like quarrying, mining, heavy industry, particularly where there's a lot of muscle and brawn required. Men will work very intensively, and then they'll not work for longish periods after that, which can lead to the impoverishment of the family. But again, I think because work is so crucial to men's understanding of manhood and masculinity at this time, that again is not hugely common. It happens, but it's not a hugely common thing. There's a lot of work available. To be a man, you work, and that is clearly the option. You know, most men do work by some means or another, and these are not the biggest category. What turns out to be much more significant than that is men who don't share their wages. So these are men who do go to work full long week in, week out, often very difficult labour, but who don't do that thing that Billy Cotton describes his father doing, coming home and literally passing the wages over to the mother. They pass some of the money over, but they don't pass all of the money over. And there's a correlation here with heavy drinking. There's a lot of very heavy drinking going on. In Victorian Britain, alcohol is very abundant. It's hardly taxed at all, so it's very cheap, it's very unregulated. It's part of the Victorian laissez-faire ideology. So there's a lot of problem drinking going on, and a lot of money is being funneled into alcohol rather than into families. In addition to that, we also have desertion, men just leaving their families altogether. And that in some ways is much more of a catastrophic outcome than desertion. So fathers who desert, than mortality, sorry, fathers who desert have nearly always been poor breadwinners before they've gone. They nearly always were not working regularly, or they were not sharing their wages. However, there is some male money coming into the household. When the desertion happens, there is no money coming into the household, and that's quite a difference. And in addition, divorce isn't possible. So unlike mortality, where families can patch themselves back together, widows and widowers marry because the man needs a wife just as much as the wife needs a husband. Families can be knitted back together through remarriage. With desertion, that isn't an option. So that's a very serious outcome for women and for families. And then there were a few, the rest I couldn't really figure out what was going on. Obviously, these autobiographies aren't written with the thought that somebody will come back in 100 years' time and ask this kind of question. So we don't know what's going on in the others. But certainly, I think we can see there's a lot going on in families, and the idea that male wages capture in its entirety what's going on to living standards is unrealistic. So just a couple of other points, and then I'll close and move over to questions. Arthur Harding, I started with him at the beginning. I think it's important to say I've tried to divide fathers up into one category or not, so I can place them somewhere in the graph there. Actually, human family life is not clean and neat in that way at all, and Arthur Harding shows us this really nicely. He writes 2 autobiographies. In the first autobiography, he describes his father as suffering from bad eyesight. Through failing sight, he could not keep us. He was also unemployed for a period, and this was because of his failing sight. So Arthur Harding, I would originally have put him in that grey category with fathers who were unemployed or fathers who were ill, because that's basically what Arthur tells us in this autobiography. Interestingly, Arthur Harding provides a second version of his family through interviews with the historian Raphael Samuel, and a very different account of the father emerges there. He says his father was a loafer. He was too lazy to earn a living. So we talked about the yellow thing, the irregular worker. He describes his father as an irregular worker there. He says he's a selfish man. He only lived for himself. He was just an encumbrance, really. He describes him as a heavy drinker. So even when he is working, he doesn't share his wages. So he would have been part of that blue line, the fathers who aren't sharing their wages, often through alcoholism. He would have belonged there. And he also actually deserts the family in the end. So he would have ended up in the green category. And that's a very classic example of fathers kind of tending to sometimes sit amongst a variety of different categories. There's just some images of Arthur Harding. He starts off as a dapper young man in his suit. He's a miserable old man, and I think he dies a very. I mean, look at that picture, how he's fallen. I think it's worth emphasising. It can sound as though I'm very down on the fathers. I think it's worth emphasising that many of these men, I think, are victims as well, in many ways, victims of alcoholism, victim of overwork, with many difficulties and issues going on in their life as well. But the upshot and the thing that I'm focusing on here is what happens to family living standards. Well, when your breadwinner takes the journey that Arthur Harding's father takes, that's got a very serious economic and financial implication for the family that he's living with. So just to conclude, back where we began, the trends in real wages. There's nothing in the autobiographies that suggests this information about real wages and economic growth is wrong. I think it's probably right. I think male wages probably did go up, and quite comfortably and quite substantially. No problem with any of that. But along with real wages, you actually get a kind of a weakening of the nuclear family. And at this period, the nuclear family is the way in which welfare is sustained. We don't have a welfare state at this point. Families look after their own. So when the family becomes more fragile, as I think it does during this period of economic growth, the relationship between what happens to wages and what happens to families on an individual level is much more complicated than graphs like this make it seem. So I will stop there, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I'm getting a bit of an echo. But I'll start the conversation. Could the audience please just put your questions in the chat function, and I will come to them, and I'm sure we'll try and get Emma to answer as many questions as possible. First of all, Emma, can I ask you a question which I'm sure many of people in the audience are thinking about, which is the whole issue about working class autobiography. The fact is that, as I'm sure you won't disagree, most people don't write autobiographies. And certainly most working class people don't write autobiographies. So clearly these are complex sources, aren't they? So could you tell us a little bit about these sources? Why did people write their autobiography? What was that about? And what kinds of people, what kind of working class people would have written their autobiography? Given the problems of literacy, given the problems of getting published, I would have thought, these must be quite unusual sources, aren't they?
Really, yes. Well, I think lots to say there, Rowan. I think obviously autobiographies are a difficult and complex source. I think all sources that historians work with are difficult and complex and problematic in some ways. So I think I don't think we should get too hung up about all the issues surrounding autobiographies. Any historian engaging any source needs to ask similar sets of questions about who produced this and why. It was never for our purposes, it was always for somebody else's purpose. I think there's a very big change in what happened, in the kind of way that autobiographies are created. I think those arguments about unrepresentativity are valid for a kind of a pre-1850 period, where most people, literacy is much lower, and fewer people definitely write their autobiography and could have written their autobiography because they don't know how to write and they don't have access to paper, and they just couldn't have produced it. So there's a very serious issue there. But as we move into the Victorian period, we really get very different kinds of autobiographies written, and they're created in different ways, particularly with the rise of social history and oral history in the 1960s. You start to get historians going into old people's homes, putting out calls on the radio and simply saying, give us your autobiography, tell us about your life. And they'll even help with the creation of the autobiography through going in and interviewing and doing the writing. And I think you really do see a very different kind of autobiography emerge. And some of these sources that I'm looking at were created and produced in the 1970s and in the 1980s. So clearly the barriers for literacy are very different by the 1980s and much reduced compared to the barriers that were there in the 19th century. I think with respect to the argument that I'm making here, I think the really important point is, I think, yes, of course, not everybody writes an autobiography and there will be some biases. I think the really significant question for me is the bias one that will lead us to, I mean, I'm trying to argue that many fathers are failing effectively, that there's a problem with the breadwinner model and it's becoming particularly acute in this period. So the question is, are the autobiographies likely to over-exaggerate, to overemphasize the failing father in some way? That's the real problem that we've got. And I don't really see any reason why that would be the case. And I think when you see how people describe their fathers and their families, you see over and over that they keep trying to deny there was any problem in their family, because it's not the done thing to air your dirty laundry in public. So they'll be very apologetic as they say all these things. I shouldn't say this about my father, they'll say, and then they'll go on and say something really critical about him. They know they don't want to talk about this. It's just that you can't actually write your life story without commenting on your father as a breadwinner. So despite the fact I think there are very many problems with autobiographies as sources, I don't think it's really convincing. I mean, this is before the misery memoir. We're long before the misery memoir at this point. People are trying to edit out the dirty bits of their life, not to provide salacious accounts of them. So I don't think we need to worry unduly that they are over-exaggerating the failing father. And I think that's for me, that's the key point here.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see some great questions, by the way, coming in, and also some much appreciation for your talk. So I'll just ask, I'll do talk just a little bit further, and then I'm going to draw on some of the questions that I can see coming in. Have you thought about autobiographies in literary terms at all? I mean, have you thought about maybe at least the sort of the forms of language, the kind of self-fashioning that you get in the autobiography as a sort of literary form? Have you thought very much about that, or do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I would say I haven't thought about that very much, and I think, but I do think historians have thought about that a lot. I do think historians have thought quite carefully about how people are presenting their story. I mean, clearly, no one can write everything about their life. You select the things, and then you present that into a relatively ordered narrative. Now, it is quite interesting that some of the autobiographies are not actually very rational narratives in the way that something like the Lovett autobiography with a beginning, a middle and an end. Sometimes these are sketchings, sometimes these are jottings, sometimes these are very short, sometimes they're just a few pages long. They take a great variety of different forms. I do think historians have spent quite a long time thinking about the form of the autobiography. I don't have any problem with that, and I think we obviously, I mean, it's clear that autobiographies write around difficult issues in really fascinating ways. However, I think I want to not simply focus on the form of the autobiography, because if we spend too much time focusing on the form of the autobiography, we never get around to telling a story about it. We never get around to really listening to what they're telling us. We just, it's very easy to get bogged down in the way in which they're writing, which is very rich and is a very interesting theme of inquiry. And I would say for me, that's just not something I pursue, because I do want to also know how life was changing in the Victorian period. And at some point you need to stop with thinking about the form of the source and just interrogate the source for what it says.
And I'd just like to address the that point you make that, of course, your male wages are going up. On the other hand, when you look at what you're actually seeing on the ground, there's a very different kind of story. And I suspect many people who are listening are familiar with those debates around the Industrial Revolution, essentially the optimist school versus the pessimist school. And I was wondering, where does your research really where do you place yourself in that? Do you see it essentially the Industrial Revolution bring about prosperity, or do you see it, as Edward Thompson would say, as a cataclysm in the lives of the poor?
Interesting. So, I mean, I think so long as I was looking at male autobiographies, it felt, I feel that despite these narratives about the cataclysm of the poor, it's very striking when you look at the autobiographies, particularly earlier ones looking at the Industrial Revolution. You have many men who were born in the countryside and lived that rural life for the early part of their life. At some point they moved to the cities, and it is difficult and there are drawbacks, but they never go back to the countryside. So I think those arguments tend to be held up by making claims about how nice it is in the countryside that I really don't find any evidence for. I don't really like the idea of framing it in terms of optimists and pessimists, because it kind of suggests a uniformity of which it's good for working people or it's bad for working people. And I think, I know it's a cop out, but I actually think it's a much more complicated story. And I do think, I think what we can say very clearly is British society becomes much more complex. It's much more divided and much more complex. I think there are definitely working class people who are winners in this this new world. I think the cities do offer higher waged work, and people like higher waged work. They're not romantic about a low wage job in the countryside. Of course, they want a better paid work in the city. They like that. But I do think society becomes much more complicated, and I think there are definite losers. I think children, particularly in industrial areas, do very badly because there's so much work available. They get ushered into the workplace at a much younger age, and I don't think that's good news for children. And I think it's a very complicated story for women. I think actually part of the inequality is families become more unequal. I think the traditional family was much more equal because what the wife did in terms of making the food and what the man did in terms of providing the money to buy the food meant there was a real kind of equality between husbands and wives, and a kind of equality inside the family. Not total, but there was a dependency. Men depended on women as much as women depended on men. When men can start to earn these much higher wages, that dependency is broken down and men start to become more powerful within the family. So I think taking from that perspective, I think women and children were definitely losers, or definitely had things to lose. If you were married to a good breadwinner, of course, you were one of the beneficiaries, but your position as a woman was more precarious than it had been previously.
Yeah. And of course, in a sense, the tragic story is that of Victorian childhood, the way you tell it, actually. Okay, I'm going to take some questions that we've been getting. I've just gone back to the top one I can see, which is from Christine Corton. Your talk implies that women never worked, but I'm sure that this must have been the case, especially when women were deserted. Also, they did have the option of judicial separations when a magistrate would demand alimony from the husband if he could be found. What do you think about that?
Well, certainly I don't want to imply that women didn't work. They most definitely did work. What I was trying to say in a hurried way is that women don't take home very much of the wage bill. So almost all of the wages, the majority of money that is being paid through wages is being paid out to women, to men. That's partly because there's a very big pay gap, but there's also because there's a very big participation gap as well. So women are definitely working. What they're not doing is earning very much money through their labour. So obviously those deserted wives, yeah, of course they have to go out for work, and go out to work they do. They don't take very much of the national wage bill home, because whereas an unskilled male labourer will earn 20 shillings a week and a skilled male labourer will earn 40 shillings a week, women might be able to get 10 shillings a week. And most women don't work if they've got large families. There are real exceptions to that in the industrial areas, in where good paid factory workers available in Lancashire and areas like this. Yes, women definitely do go out to work, but they tend not to work if they've got young children or large families. So there's still a lot of women retreating from the workforce, from the labour force in these areas. So I certainly don't mean to imply that women don't work, simply that women can't substitute, and this goes to the heart of it really. Women certainly do work, but they cannot substitute for a male breadwinner. All they can do is maintain a very, very low standard of living, and of course they've got the household to run at the same time. So it's a far from optimal situation for women to be in. And you're right, the separations are possible. They're never mentioned in the autobiographies. I think because of the costs involved in making that kind of, we're talking about working men who were never providing for their families in the first instance, so there's not going to be any alimony. So effectively, if you're in this kind of situation, a meaningful separation is very, very difficult for you to access. And I haven't got any examples in the autobiographers who do manage to access that kind of separation.
Great. The next, we now have a comment, I think, rather than a question from Ailsa Boyd, who first of all says, fascinating talk. And her comment is that this is very much what is described in The Five by Hallie Rubenhold, which for people who don't know is actually currently a big bestseller. It's about the women who were murdered by Jack the Ripper. And in that book, as Ailsa says, women abandoned by their husbands had very few options for getting money for their families, as the expectation was the man would provide the main money. And of course, that is your point, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. Then we have a question from Stephanie Bates. Did any of the autobiographies mention the mothers or sisters of the writers actually working, and what sort of jobs did they do?
Oh yes, lots of mention of the work of everybody. I mean, work is just so important in working class households that all the work that people do tends to very often get to mention. And this is a way around trying to make sense of the Industrial Revolution. It's a way of trying to make sense of the earlier period through the Industrial Revolution, because sorry, I'm getting slightly distracted.
We're getting a bit of static of some sort.
Sorry. Because people do precisely talk about what their mother does. So what do they do? Well, women work in the factories. If you're in a factory area, they take in needle, and what they do varies a lot according to whether they're working inside or outside the house. And there's a lot of trying to generate a little bit of money by taking work inside the house, because that's compatible with family responsibilities. So young girls, before they've got a family, they might go out and work as a servant. That's obviously the big one. Or they might go and work in a factory. There could be a warehouse or a shop or something like that they work in. After marriage, they're much more likely, if they have to work, to try and do so inside the house. So they take in laundry, they take in lodgers, they take in needlework, these kinds of things. So classic women's work, you know, it's all almost all of it, apart from the factory work, is an extension of women's housekeeping and domestic responsibilities. They just try and monetize it. But I've got a lovely quote from one of my autobiographers who says, you know, she spent all her life doing the same thing, cooking and cleaning, but when she was young, she got paid for it, and then she got married and she didn't get paid for it after that. And that kind of sums up a lot of women's experiences of the workplace.
Great. And we have a very interesting question coming in here from Sue Day, who says, is it possible that the lack of job security and income impacted on the mental health of workers, leading to the desire to drink, perhaps, or desertion in order to evade responsibilities?
Oh, I think so, definitely. I mean, I think the children, or the adult children now writing about their fathers, they tend to be very unsympathetic and very unforgiving, mostly of fathers who drank the family's money away. They tend to be very critical and yeah, a difficult thing for them to talk about, and they don't have any sympathy for their father. When you see over and over and over the same story being told by the autobiographers of their father doing this same pattern of behaviour, you start to think, well, that maybe there are bigger forces, because this isn't just an individual failing here and then another one here, another one here. It seems to be actually a pattern of working class culture. You tend to find it in the same kind of areas. So it's very common in very hard physical labour, dangerous physical labour, docks, mines, these kinds of professions, heavy industry of various different kinds, quarries. These are the kind of areas where you often get a lot of heavy drinking. You find it much less in the countryside. You find it much less amongst factory workers, where there's a real need to be up and at your station first thing in the morning, and there's no real kind of wiggle room for taking time off and going on a bender. So it definitely seems to be connected with very onerous forms of physical labour. And I think a lot of these men are self-medicating, as we would say nowadays. They're basically trying to find some release and some solace, some rest and relaxation. And some of the autobiographies talk very eloquently about how, you know, their drinking goes, you know, really falls out, really gets out of control after the death of a child, for example, or some other kind of catastrophe. One describes how it's a way of getting human connection, really. It's a way of, he can be friendly with everybody in the pub, and he can feel loved if he's got a whiskey in his hand. And because the household is so divided, and you very often see this terrible negative cycle where the family get more and more furious with the father for drinking the wages. So he goes out of the house and then he's drinking all night, comes back, and it just is a really negative cycle that they're involved in. The family are starting to hate the father more and more. Family hate the father. He goes off to the pub. Then they hate him more. So he goes, and these problems can never be solved. So yeah, it's really a pretty miserable story when you look at it in the whole. And I think you definitely see, as I say, we describe it as self-medicating now, really, as a response to a very difficult life.
Yeah. And now we have a question from student Georgia Commons. Thank you for the very interesting talk. I was curious as to whether there were any regional patterns with the wages and the sharing of them.
Yeah, brilliant question. There is a regional pattern. There is. The really striking thing is agricultural workers in the countryside almost never fail to share their wages. You don't get these problems. A father's deserting, a father's not working, a father's choosing leisure, a father's not sharing their wage. You just have, out of 600 autobiographers, half of them are rural. You almost never see this in the countryside. It does occasionally, but even when it does happen in the countryside, it will be because it's a blacksmith or something who's basically a small businessman rather than a farm worker. So it is really rare. It's really quite rare in agricultural areas. And I think there's lots of reasons for that. There's lots of social pressure for men to provide, but also these families, they remain much poorer than elsewhere. Everybody remains dependent on everybody else from a very young age. Children start doing their chores, and men and women have their chores, and everybody kind of comes together, and it's a real team effort keeping everything going. So you definitely see in the urban areas more, and it's not even just in the urban areas. As I say, it's particularly in these high wage and physically demanding jobs, docks, mines, these kinds of areas. It happens in factory areas as well, but it's less pronounced and less noticeable in factory work. Factory owners want reliable, steady workers, and they'll pay quite well for them. So you don't tend to find the heavy drinking. Maybe, or if a man is in a Preston and he's working in a mill and he's got heavy drink, he'll end up losing that job and doing some other kind of employment, and it all kind of starts to unravel from there. So there are definite patterns, and it does definitely seem to be, that's the thing that's really interesting. It seems to happen in the areas where you've got lots of work and lots of male wages. So it's a really unintuitive finding that it's in the areas with the money that you get these particular problems, and in the areas without the money and without the opportunities, and particularly in rural areas, you see much less of these problems emerging.
Great. Now we've got a question here from Jill Lee, who, first of all, thanks you for your talk. And she points out her parents were born into working class families next to the Clyde near Glasgow in the 1920s and 30s. And her feeling is that prior to the welfare state, the life experiences we've just been hearing about are still very similar right up to the Second World War. Certainly the stories of women waiting at the shipyard gates on wages day to prevent their husbands from getting drunk. Sounds very familiar. I guess what comes out of that, Emma, is when does this world come to an end, or does it?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it's much more pronounced in some areas than in others. I love that example from the Clyde, and it reminds me of Catherine Cookson, the popular novelist's experiences. She's kind of Newcastle, that kind of area. Again, it's shipbuilding, heavy industry. And I think some of these heavy industry areas, you have a particularly pronounced division between men's work. Men's work is outdoors, is very physical, it's often quite skilled, it's quite high wage, and there's no place for women in any of these labour markets at all. Whereas the factory, even when, obviously in the factory, men still get the better paid work. Okay, so there's still not kind of equality inside the factory, but inside the factory you have lots of work for men and lots of work for women, and people are working together. And in those areas you often see households where chores and responsibilities are shared much more equally. But these areas like Glasgow and Newcastle, some of these mining areas as well, you really see this divided household. And I'm not at all surprised to hear somebody saying it was like this in the 1920s. I've also, a long time ago in the 90s, I was in a different, Joanna Burke was teaching me a course at Birkbeck, and we had somebody describe exactly what I've talked about here, about how his father would come home, give all the wages to mother, and mother would do all of the spending. So this is a 20th century story as well. I think the big story, I'm not a 20th century historian, I haven't followed it. And I think if I write one more book before I retire, I think this will probably be what I want to work on, what does happen in the 20th century, because it is so fascinating. I think the welfare state starts to change this because women cease to be so utterly dependent on a male breadwinner. So I think new stories would emerge around the time of the welfare state, and because that's just not available in our period or through the early 20th century as well. I think a very similar story remains in place. I have no reason to think the story I'm telling wouldn't extend several decades into the 20th century. I just had to take a pragmatic decision to stop at that point.
Yeah. And of course, it'd be interesting to think about how deindustrialization from the 1970s onwards actually impacts on that in gender terms. We've got a question coming in from Leslie Cunningham. He says, in volume 1 of Das Kapital, Marx had a somewhat contradictory attitude to women being in the workplace. He was particularly concerned at times about the detrimental effects on the family. It seems to me, Leslie, is saying this, that the ideal of the family wage provided by a male breadwinner actually left a lot to be desired in practice, which of course you've demonstrated. But his question is, was this discussed by socialists and feminists at the time?
Very interesting. So yes, but people are starting to discuss or people start to have new discussions. Victorian Britain is a period of change, and new discussions are emerging about how who should work, how much people should earn, what the relationship between master and employer should be. Lots of debates around all of these, and very many other kind of cognate and related debates are going on. What are people saying? There's more difficult to pin down exactly what people are saying, but I would say also this is the period where the idea of the breadwinner wage starts to get its intellectual substance. So in reality, men and women had always done different work. Men had done much more paid work. The kinds of jobs that they were doing was different. Women had definitely worked, but it tended to be more seasonal, more cyclical. The wage rates were nearly always lower. It was different kind of jobs that they were doing. So this idea of a divided workplace and women doing most of the domestic work and the childcare, there's nothing new about any of them. So there's lots that's a kind of part of a much older story. But what we do get at this moment is the idea that women shouldn't work. And people hadn't bothered to say that before. Nobody thought women shouldn't work. It was obvious that everybody in the household does whatever work they can and that they need to. Everybody works, and there wasn't such a sharp division between the paid work outside the home and the unpaid work inside the home. It was all necessary in order to keep body and soul together. So it's all necessary. It's not a big division. This is all changing in our period, and I think the unions in particular are interested in trying to earn higher male wages, and they're very often actually quite regressive in this. So their argument is that a man should earn a breadwinner wage, a wage that is big enough to mean that his wife doesn't need to work. So the male unionists take this line, and it's not necessarily at all helpful for women, because many women need to be in the workplace, and they're often quite opposed to equal pay for women inside the workplace, because it undermines their vision of society. Their vision of society is that women should be at home and looking after houses, and they're not concerned about agitating for women's pay. There are some feminists by the late 19th century who were starting to argue that women should get equal pay in the workplace, but they're starting from a very low base. And through most of the 19th century, the arguments have been around breadwinners and men earning a wage that's good enough to keep everyone, without any discussion, obviously, about the obvious problems, the pitfalls, what happens when a woman doesn't have a breadwinner, and what mechanisms are you going to put in place to ensure that the man really does share his wages with the family. So.
Okay. The next question is from Gareth, who says, thank you. I very much enjoyed the talk and the book, which presents a very vivid account. So I think you've sold a copy there. In the book, you touch briefly on the recreations and pastimes of some families, mainly the men. Could you say more about the cultural life of both the men and women in the autobiographies?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I mean, you have to divide according to sex, because the men do have leisure, and through most of my period down to 1914, there's very little evidence of women really having anything that we would call leisure. Now, that's partly because we tend to piece it together by, or so far as women are, or as far as the women are concerned, by what their children say about them. And of course, as a woman, I mean, a woman is unlikely to have any leisure by virtue of having children. So we kind of mothers are the least likely to have any leisure, and it tends to be autobiographers talking about their parents. So we see them talking about their fathers and their mothers, and fathers can have leisure. And of course, that's part of the deal of being a breadwinner. You're a breadwinner, you go out to work, you earn your wages, you give most of it to the family, but you keep some of it back. So what are the men doing? Not much evidence of organised sport through most of our football. I mean, I know that's supposed to be getting big, but there's very little, really quite little evidence of people being involved in football as spectators or anything like that. It's mostly centred, most male sociability is centred on the pub. Religion is definitely a form of some form of leisure. It provides a lot of sociability, so religion is there. Political engagement, unions, men are doing all of these kinds of activities. They might enjoy reading, they can use libraries, working men's clubs mix with people like them. Cycling is starting to take off at the end of the century. So really a wide variety of different things that men are involved in. And it's very normal for men to have a little bit of leisure. I would say the pub is clearly the dominant thing that men are doing. Women, much less evidence. The Mothers' Union is starting to develop, like early 20th century. And there are some interesting stories of women getting involved in the Mothers' Union. Now, they tend to develop in industrial areas, which I think is quite interesting. But very often, those who get involved will talk a lot about the barriers to their involvement, how it was very difficult to have any kind of leisure because there was no money. But I think even more than that, what comes out very strongly is the feeling that they have no right to leisure, that they have no right to go and join the Mothers' Union and to sit around for an afternoon and to discuss issues. They don't have the right to it. So I think there's very little sense, and people also describe their mothers. They never had any leisure. They just didn't have any money. Occasionally they liked to go to the theatre or the music hall, but they didn't do that very often. They never really saw their mothers doing it. So I mean, I think that's partly because there's definitely a trope of the self-sacrificing mother who's not supposed to be enjoying herself with leisure. That's part of it. But I think there was a real problem, both in terms of access to the money, but I mean, as some of them say, it wasn't really the money all the time. They did have them. Once they decided to get involved with the Mothers' Union, they did actually have the time. What had held them back for a really long time was doubts about whether they really had the right to do anything outside the family. So very, like everything with the Victorian working class, is just a massive gender divide, really.
Yeah, and in fact, could I just come in on that one? Because it's interesting. You mentioned, of course, churches. Of course, I mean, how important are churches or chapels, or in terms of reinforcing this sort of gender divide? I mean, presumably there's a story there, isn't there? I mean, I can see lots of other things about the economy and the way it's organised, but presumably you can never talk about the world of the 19th century without talking about religion. So there's something going on there.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, not everybody would necessarily call the church leisure. It really depends what kind of church you're involved in. But a lot of churches do provide all sorts of sociability and companionship, fellowship, activities, excursions. So it very much depends on what kind of church you're talking about. And it is true. I mean, women can certainly get involved. And a few of the autobiographers do say that was my mother's treat. My mother's treat was to go to church on a Sunday. But they'll also say things like, well, obviously we went with her. So mother's leisure, I mean, churches don't really provide independent, validating, liberating leisure for mothers. They definitely provide an escape and a place outside of the home. They say they'll describe having their leisure time, but the children are also there. And I think many parents will attest to the fact that if your children are with you, it's not really leisure as you understand the word. So churches, they're a kind of amorphous hybrid. They don't entirely and fully fit into the leisure framework, but I think we can make a case for putting them in there.
Yeah, and also, can I just ask you about the pubs? We always think about pubs, certainly in the 19th century, as a sort of masculine zone, and indeed, really, right up to maybe almost up to today. Certainly, women even now have shall we say, a complex relationship with the pub, and yet you did get some women in pubs in the 19th century. So it's not entirely masculine. I don't just mean the barmaid. I mean, have you thought about at all about those women who do go into pubs?
Yes, I do agree. I mean, women do go into pubs. Women can, and women do that. I mean, they're not kind of completely excluded. They're not allowed in them. So women definitely do go into pubs. It's just they tend to do so very much less. I mean, you go into the pub because you've got the time to be there. Mothers don't have that kind of time and that freedom of responsibility, and because you've got a little bit of money to spend. And women don't have very much money to themselves. A married woman will only really, if she's earning her own living, she's not going to have any spare money. If she's married, the money that she's given is not for her personal consumption, it's for running the household. I mean, having said that, alcohol is an addictive substance as well. Yep. So we certainly do get autobiographers describing mothers who've got drink problems. It's not unheard of at all, and women are using and accessing pubs. It's just simply that they're doing so in a very different way and to a very different degree, really.
Yeah. Now we've got some comments coming up, which I'll relay to you. Jill Lee says, on the accuracy of oral histories, I've conducted a few quite recently and find that memories of childhood and parents are selective, but the interest lies in how they are remembered and not necessarily by the accuracy per se. Have you found that with your autobiographies? I mean, there's presumably a process of selection, sometimes not for any terrible reason, but just because one inevitably selects as you create these narratives. So have you thought much about that? What do they say and what do they not say?
Oh, it's such an interesting question. I think particularly the things that they don't say. I mean, there are some things that are just not talked about in the autobiographies at all. Things that must have happened. So there's almost no mention of sexual assault or sexual abuse or rape or anything like that. Very, very. Occasionally, a couple of cases of children who have been molested, but very, very little. Given that we're looking at many are in institutions and we're looking at very crowded homes, I mean, there's much less there than one might expect. Homosexuality is never mentioned, not only in terms of the author, but in their family, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, just never mentioned at all. Lots of taboos around any sexual pleasure. These kinds of things are never discussed. There are lots of things that are not talked about. And I think it is hugely interesting the way in which people will describe their families. I mean, they might start their autobiography and say, oh, one of them, he starts off, I've had a really good family. Can't say a word against my parents. They were great. And then as you kind of move on, it's like, except for my father, he was a really heavy drinker. And my mother, she was a nag. And then goes on to explain how he was terrified a lot of his childhood. There was some shouting, there's violence in the home. And then you'll suddenly revert back to the jaunty tone. Oh, my parents couldn't have done more for me. They couldn't have done more. It's fascinating the way in which people talk about their autobiography. Another one, just a lovely example, he provides a kind of a straightforward account in the early chapters, and then it's on to work. And then kind of nestling 3/4 of the way through, there's a chapter called Skeletons in the Closet. And in this chapter, he suddenly starts to tell you that there's lots of problems in the home, lots of conflict, lots of fighting, and the mother was very violent towards him and to the father, who's not there very much because she's violent, doesn't want to be there, but the children can't get away, and that's the skeleton in the closet. And then so there's so much to say, and it's partly why they're such a rich source to work with, and you can't always take everything at face value, and I don't. You really have to, you do read between the lines, and you do have to decide for yourself, despite the kind of the circumnavigation that's been taken around some of these issues, where you want to put the emphasis.
Now, we've got some comments coming up which are, in a sense, vindicate what you're saying. Gareth says that your talk has real echoes for me of the life of my father and grandparents in a mining village in the 1930s. Hugh Jones says, for people of my grandparents' generation, born in the 1900s, in the South Wales mining village where they lived, anecdotally, there was a massive social stigma attached to the inability of husbands to provide for the family. Actually, that's a good point, actually, isn't it? I mean, you talk a lot about feckless fathers, but presumably there was a lot of, as it were, informal policing within working class communities, as Hugh is saying. Did you find that? That sort of stigma?
Yes, there's definitely and I think that's why the autobiographers don't usually give you a straightforward narrative about how awful it was and how their father failed, because that is just, it is quite taboo, and it's not the story that anybody wants to be telling, and they know it was transgressive and they know it shouldn't have been like that, and they'll sometimes even say, I realise, they'll remember the moment where they realised their family wasn't like others. They realised they were much poorer than the other kids at the school, or they've got these kind of, you know, very sad memories around the whole thing. There is policing. I think in rural areas as well, that policing does a lot of the work of keeping fathers on the straight and narrow. There's this kind of policing in the industrial areas, but it's not such an effective policing that it stops the transgressions happening. Yeah. So it's definitely there, but it's not very powerful. Whereas I think in rural areas that is a very powerful mechanism for keeping families and fathers in particular at the hearth doing what they ought to be doing.
Linda Salkeld tells us that in fishing towns like Grimsby, wives and or children would go down dock to collect their husband's or father's wages to make sure money came to the house for food and bills. Many a child was missing from school on Friday afternoons. It was known as the fish dock races. Right up to the end of the UK fishing in the 1960s, the fishermen were known as three-day millionaires, as that was the usual days that they spent on shore. She doesn't have the date when this started, but it would have been early in the mass fishing industry. Did you find that lots of women actually getting their hands on the wages first rather than the men?
Oh yes, definitely. Stories of trying to get the wages out of the men, and I love that, Linda. And I you know what I mean, because you talk on this, I talk on this, and people will always come forward and say, yes, I know this already. I know this from my personal experience. And I just think, I think as historians, we should know this. I shouldn't need to have written this book. We should all know that men are not pure, reliable, or they're humans, they're fallible. We all know that there was a problem getting the wages out, and yet for some reason this has never been fed back in to our graphs and our tables looking at real wages. It should be common sense that, okay, that's fine, now we know what the male wage is, now let's do a whole load more work. But it's very interesting that most historians are just quite satisfied to look at the male wage and not think about these things, even though we know perfectly well what these issues are.
Yeah. And Katerina Hardy, a student, says, as alcohol is often seen as an addiction due to how normalised it was to drink because of the quality of the water, would addiction to opiates have also affected the sharing of wages? Do you find anything like that?
I didn't find very much evidence of opiate addiction. I don't think I found any. No, I've never. Yes, it's another unspoken thing, and I don't think it's unspoken about because it was. I don't know if it was taboo. I mean, you never know, do you? I just don't know. It doesn't emerge.
Yeah, I would have been very surprised about that, actually.
Yeah.
Alice Jackman says, hearing about these autobiographies reminded me of Robert Tressel's book, The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropist, a pro-socialist book, which made me wonder whether there was a connection between membership of the unions and the ability to provide for families. For example, was a male worker who was a member of a union more likely to be a better breadwinner?
I would not say he was more likely to be a better breadwinner, but I wouldn't say he was more likely to be a worse breadwinner either. I think there's a certain type of respectable working class man who wants to provide for his family, who wants to put lino down on the kitchen floor, who wants to have gas and later electricity or a boiler. I mean, there are definitely respectable working class men who want, have this great pride in the home. I wouldn't say union. I don't think that marries particularly with the union movement. I mean, arguably those involved in the church, the Sunday school movement, temperance, these kinds of movements, I think, particularly lend themselves towards domestic responsibility. Unions don't lend themselves quite so naturally. Some of the fathers, some of the men in the union are also very into the domestic sphere as well, but not necessarily. I mean, the union is a very, very male sphere, and all of the work of the union is done at the pub, and it's all done with drinking, unlike something like temperance, obviously, but also a lot of religion. So it's not the most natural fit, I would say, between respectability. It can be, but not always.
Great. Kay Norman tells us that there are echoes of this in her life. She was born in the 1960s in Scunthorpe, major steel town, and my father collected his wages in cash on a Thursday until the early 1990s. He handed over the housekeeping to my mother to keep house. By the end of his working life, she was the deputy head in education, and her salary far outstripped her father's pay, which again, you know, is part of that, very much part of that story you're telling us, isn't it? Leslie Cunningham thanks you for such an enlightening talk and for answering his question in such detail. Then Christine Corton comes back with actually a very interesting question. What about gardening as a working class leisure pursuit? Was there not a growth in this at this time?
Yes, gardening certainly is a working class leisure pursuit. I mean, you get most of the gardening that I see in the autobiographies is happening in rural areas. It's partly leisure, but I mean, a lot of the time it's allotments, it's food that they're growing. And there's obviously a kind of a fine line between, I mean, that food that they're creating feeds the family, and often really the chicken that they're keeping, if they're keeping a pig, it all really improves the diet of the household, really improves the variety of the food that can be eaten. So and the men love doing it. It's not that they don't love doing it, but there's so far as the gardening I see in these working class communities, it tends to focus on food production rather than on flowers. And there is some decorative gardening going on as well, but there's a definite focus on food provision. So it sits. You know, it is a leisure, but it kind of also sits within these older ways of household labour, where households just everybody does everything that they can to improve living standards, and tending animals, growing crops, chopping wood. These will all be part of the activities that need to be done. They're not viewed as leisure, but certainly by the early 20th century, you do see people are kind of rebranding some of this as leisure, but it's still got this economic function that it serves as well.
Yeah. I mean, would you agree, Emma, that really men, working class men, certainly in this period, had a very difficult relationship with the domestic interior, with the home? I mean, I think about Robert Roberts's autobiography, The Classic Slum, which I'm sure you know, and he talks about his father coming home from work and then just sitting there having his tea and just biding time till he can go to the pub. That he almost hasn't, the way Robert Roberts tells it, his father has almost no role in the home. The mother, you know, rules the home. The father doesn't seem to have much role in it. Was that your impression from your autobiographies?
Yes, definitely. Certainly in some of these urban industrial areas, not in the countryside. Men have a role in the domestic home. They've got to chop the wood. You know, there's lots for a man to do. They've got things to fix. They've got a chicken coop to fix. They've got lots to do in the house. They have a really clear role inside the house. In these urban areas, that's much less the case. And there are other examples, definitely other examples of fathers who almost, I mean, some of them describe, I think it was a Glasgow one, he describes how his father never spoke to him. And he only really remembers one conversation with him, and that was when he'd taken a day off school because he was ill, and he went upstairs and says, "How are you feeling?" And it was an amazing thing to be spoken to by a father. That's quite unusual. Fathers are usually speaking to their children, but it's not hugely atypical either. It's not at all atypical to have people's fathers die and for them to say, "I never really knew my father. He'd gone before I got up." Often, you know, when I was little, he didn't come back till after I was in bed. At the weekends, he was really tired and grouchy, didn't want anything to do with us kids. or he was out of the house doing his hobbies or his pub. So it's a very common, and I think it does again feed into some of the difficulties. Was the household is so divided, it ceases to become sometimes a very friendly and welcoming environment for the father. And of course, then you get this kind of negative spiral where they look for what, I mean, we all want companionship and we all want to feel connected to people. And if you're not getting that inside the home and you're just a waste of space inside the home, then of course you're going out to the pub as well. So I think this is definitely a feature of the Victorian city, definitely.
And this, I think, will be the last question. Can I just ask you, you've of course done this wonderful work with autobiographies. Another source that at least is written by working class, might be written by working class people, are diaries. How plentiful are diaries for the 19th century by working class men and women?
Diaries are much harder to find.
Yeah.
Much harder to find, and I've found much fewer. I don't know why they have not survived in the same kind of way and why they're so difficult to locate, but they are definitely harder to locate. The other thing about diaries is when you find a diary, you'll get a random diary from 1873 by a person whose name you may not even necessarily know. You know, even if you know the name, you don't necessarily know anything about that person. And it's just 1873. You know nothing about who they are. You don't necessarily know how old they are. You don't know what's going on in their life beyond what you can see inside the diary. So even when diaries do survive, they're actually very difficult to work with. I've found them very difficult to work with because it's very difficult. Sometimes it depends a bit on the diary, but it can be very difficult to say anything very much because it's just providing a list of activities without very much context and contextualization. So they are a difficult source to work with, difficult to find, and even when you do find them, quite complicated to work with.
Great. I think we ought to leave it there. And I think that the sheer number of questions that you've had and the comments that have been coming in, I think show the appreciation from the audience for your talk. I should have said one thing I should have said actually in my introduction to you is, of course, you are, amongst other things, really the historian of the gender pay gap. Actually, that's what this is really all about. I can see a comment just come in from Jane Knott. Thank you for a really interesting talk and putting on Eventbrite and opening it up to non-students. So yeah, absolutely. And indeed, we hope we'll do more events like this. I'd like to thank you very much, Professor Griffin, for an illuminating talk, for great comments. And I hope people will be inspired by this to go and read Professor Griffin's book, Breadwinner, An Intimate History of the Victorian Economy. So thank you all for coming and for being part of this. There will be a recording of this, which I think will be available somehow. And above all, thank you, Emma Griffin. Bye.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
And we can't clap, as it were, but I'll clap virtually for all of you. Okay, thank you. Right. And lots of words coming in saying thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Emma.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.